Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue reading Citizen of the Galaxy by Robert Heinlein. Thorby is now on the trade ship Sisu, and that's about all he can say because no one will talk to him except an anthropologist who's traveling with the crew. But it could be worse. He's warm and safe and fed, and maybe something else will happen. Thorby slept in his new, wonderful bed that night. He was left alone the next morning, but he was not bored as he had so many toys to play with. He opened things out and caused them to fold up again, delighted at how each gadget folded in on itself to occupy minimum space. He concluded that it must be witchcraft. Baslam had taught him that magic and witchcraft were nonsense, but the teaching had not fully stuck. Pop had known everything, but just the same, how could you fly in the face of experience? Jubal had plenty of witches, and if they weren't practicing magic, what were they doing? He had just opened his bed for the 6th time when he was almost shocked out of the shoes he had dared to try on by an unholy racket. It was the ship's alarm, calling all hands to general quarters, and it was merely a drill, but Thorby did not know that. When he re-swallowed his heart, he opened the door and looked out. People were running at breakneck speed. Shortly, the corridors were empty. He went back into his bunkie, waited, and tried to understand. Presently, his sharp ears detected the absence of the soft sigh of the ventilation system. But there was nothing he could do about it. He should have mustered in the innermost compartment along with children and other non-combatants, but he did not know. So he waited. The alarm rang again in conjunction with a horn signal, and again there were running people in the passageways. Again it was repeated until the crew had run through general quarters, hull broach, power failure, air hazard, radiation hazard, and so forth, all the general drills of a taut ship. Once the lights went out, and once, for frightening moments, Thorby experienced the bewildering sensation of freefall as the ship's artificial field cut off. After a long time of such inexplicable buffoonery, he heard the soothing strains of recall, and the ventilation system whispered back to normal. No one bothered to look for him. The old woman who mustered non-participants hadn't noticed the absence of the frackie, although she had counted the animal pets aboard. Immediately thereafter, Thorby was dragged up to see the chief officer. A man opened his door, grabbed his shoulders, and marched him away. Thorby put up with it for a short distance, then he rebelled. He had his belly full of such treatment. The gutter fighting he had learned in order to survive in Jubalpur was lacking in rules. Unfortunately, this man had learned in a school equally cold-blooded but more scientific. Thorby got in one swipe, then found himself pinned against the bulkhead with his left wrist in danger of breaking. "Cut out the nonsense." "Quit pushing me around." "I said cut out the nonsense. You're going to see the chief officer. Don't give me trouble, Frackie, or I'll stuff your head in your mouth." "I want to see Captain Krause." The man relaxed the pressure and said, "You'll see him, but the chief officer has ordered you to report, and she can't be kept waiting. So will you go quietly, or shall I carry you there in pieces?" Thorby went quietly. Pressure on a wrist joint combined with pressure on a nerve between the bones of the palm carries its own rough logic. Several decks up, he was shoved through an open door. "Chief officer, here's the frackie." "Thank you, check deckmaster. You may go." Thorby understood only the word frackie. He picked himself up and found himself in a room many times as large as his own. The most prominent thing in it was an imposing bed, but the small figure in the bed dominated the room. Only after he had looked at her did he notice that Captain Krause stood silent on one side of the bed, and that a woman, perhaps the captain's age, stood on the other. The woman in the bed was shrunken with age, but radiated authority. She was richly dressed. The scarf over her thin hair represented more money than Thorby had ever seen at one time. but Thorby noticed only her fierce sunken eyes. She looked at him. "So, oldest son, I have much trouble believing it." She spoke in Suomic. "My mother, the message could not have been faked." She sniffed. Captain Krause went on with humble stubbornness. "Hear the message yourself, my mother." He turned to Thorby and said in interlingua, "Repeat the message from your father." Obediently, not understanding, but enormously relieved to be in the presence of Pop's friend, Thorby repeated the message by rote. The old woman heard him through, then turned to Captain Krause. "What's this? He speaks our language? A Frackie?" "No, my mother, he understands not a word. That is Baslam's voice." She looked back at Thorby, spilled a stream of Suomic on him. He looked questioningly at Captain Krause. She said, "Have him repeat it again." Captain gave the order. Thorby, confused but willing, did so. She lay silent after he had concluded while the others waited. Her face screwed up in anger and exasperation. At last she rasped, "Debts must be paid." "That was my thought, my mother." "But why should the draft be drawn on us?" she answered angrily. The captain said nothing. She went on more quietly, "The message is authentic. I thought surely it must be faked. Had I known what you intended, I would have forbidden it. But, oldest son, stupid as you were right, and debts must be paid." Her son continued to say nothing. She added angrily, "Well, speak up. What coin do you propose to tender?" "I have been thinking, my mother," Krause said slowly. "Baslam demands that we care for the boy only a limited time, until we can turn him over to a hegemonic military vessel. How long will that be? A year? 2 years? But even that presents problems. However, we have a precedent, the Frackie female. The family has accepted her, though a little grumbling, but they are used to her now, even amused by her. If my mother intervened for this lad in the same way—" "Nonsense!" "But, my mother, we are obligated. Debts must be—" "Silence!" Krause shut up. She went on quietly, "Did you not listen to the wording of the burden Baslam placed on you? Succor and admonish him as if you were I. What was Baslam to this Frackie?" "Why, he speaks of him as his adopted son." "I thought you didn't think. If you take Baslam's place, what does that make you? Is there more than one way to read the words?" Krause looked troubled. The ancient went on, "Sisu pays debts in full. No half measures, no short weights. In full. The Frackie must be adopted. By you." Krause's face was suddenly blank. The other woman, who had been moving around quietly with make-work, dropped a tray. The captain said, "But, my mother, what will the family—" "I am the family." She turned suddenly to the other woman. "Oldest son's wife, have all my senior daughters attend me." "Yes, husband's mother." She curtsied and left. The chief officer looked grimly at the overhead, then almost smiled. "This is not all bad, oldest son. What will happen at the next gathering of the people?" "Why, we will be thanked." "Thanks buy no cargo." She licked her thin lips. "The people will be in debt to Sisu, and there will be a change of status of ships. We won't suffer." Krause smiled slowly. "You were always a shrewd one, my mother." "A good thing for Sisu that I am. Take the Frackie boy and prepare him. We'll do this quickly." Chapter 8. Thorby had 2 choices: be adopted quietly, or make a fuss and be adopted anyhow. He chose the first, which was sensible, as opposing the will of the chief officer was unpleasant and almost always futile. Besides, while he felt odd and rather unhappy about acquiring a new family so soon after the death of Pop, nevertheless he could see that the change was to his advantage. As a Frackie, his status had never been lower. Even a slave has equals. But most important, Pop had told him to do what Captain Krause said for him to do. The adoption took place in the dining saloon at the evening meal that day. Thorby understood little of what went on and none of what was said, since the ceremonies were in the secret language, but the captain had coached him in what to expect. The entire ship's company was there, except those on watch. Even Dr. Mater was there, inside the main door, and taking no part, but where she could see and hear. The chief officer was carried in, and everyone stood. She was settled on a lounge at the head of the officers' table, where her daughter-in-law, the captain's wife, attended her. When she was comfortable, she made a gesture, and they sat down, the captain seating himself on her right. Girls from the port moiety, the watch with the day's duty, then served all hands with bowls of thin mush. No one touched it. The chief officer banged her spoon on her bowl and spoke briefly and emphatically. Her son followed her. Thorby was surprised to discover that he recognized a portion of the captain's speech as being identical with part of the message Thorby had delivered. He could spot the sequence of sounds. The chief engineer, a man older than Krause, answered. Then several older people, both men and women, spoke. The chief officer asked a question and was answered in chorus, a unanimous assent. The old woman did not ask for dissenting votes. Thorby was trying to catch Dr. Mater's eye when the captain called to him in interlingua. Thorby had been seated on a stool alone and was feeling conspicuous, especially as persons he caught looking at him did not seem very friendly. "Come here." Thorby looked up and saw the captain and his mother looking at him. She seemed irritated, or it may have been the permanent set of her features. Thorby hurried over. She dipped her spoon in his dish, barely licked it. Feeling as if he were doing something horribly wrong, but having been coached, he dipped his spoon in her bowl, timidly took a mouthful. She reached up, pulled his head down, and pecked him with withered lips on both cheeks. He returned the symbolic caress and felt gooseflesh. Captain Krause ate from Thorby's bowl. He ate from the captain's. Then Krause took a knife, held the point between thumb and forefinger, and whispered in interlingua, "Mind you don't cry out." He stabbed Thorby in his upper arm. Thorby thought with contempt that Baslam had taught him to ignore 10 times that much pain. But blood flowed freely. Krause led him to a spot where all might see, said something loudly, and held his arm so that a puddle of blood formed on the deck. The captain stepped on it, rubbed in it with his foot, spoke loudly again, and a cheer went up. Krause said to Thorby in interlingua, "Your blood is now in the steel. Our steel is in your blood." Thorby had encountered sympathetic magic all his life, and its wild, almost reasonable logic he understood. He felt a burst of pride that he was now part of the ship. The captain's wife slapped a plaster over the cut. Then Thorby exchanged food and kisses with her, after which he had to do it right around the room, every table, his brothers and his uncles, his sisters and his cousins, and his aunts. Instead of kissing him, the men and boys grasped his hands, then clapped him across the shoulders. When he came to the table of unmarried females, he hesitated, and discovered that they did not kiss him. They giggled and squealed and blushed, and hastily touched forefingers to his forehead. Close behind him, girls with the serving duty cleared away the bowls of mush, purely ritualistic food symbolizing the meager rations on which the people could cross space if necessary, and were serving a feast. Thorby would have been clogged to his ears with mush if he had not caught on to the trick. Don't eat it, just dip the spoon, then barely taste it. But when at last he was seated, an accepted member of the family, at the starboard bachelor's table, he had no appetite for the banquet in his honor. 80-odd new relatives were too much. He felt tired, nervous, and let down. But he tried to eat. Presently, he heard a remark in which he understood only the word "fracky." He looked up and saw a youth across the table grinning unpleasantly. The president of the table, seated on Thorby's right, rapped for attention. "We'll speak nothing but interlingua tonight," he announced, "and thereafter follow the customs in allowing our new relative gradually to acquire our language." His eye rested coldly on the youngster who had sneered at Thorby. As for you, cross-cousin-in-law by marriage, I'll remind you, just once, that my adopted younger brother is senior to you, and I'll see you in my bunkie after dinner." The younger boy looked startled. "Aw, senior cousin, I was just saying—" "Drop it," the young man said quietly to Thorby. "Use your fork. People do not eat meat with fingers." "Fork? Left of your plate. Watch me. You'll learn. Don't let them get you riled. Some of these young oafs have yet to learn that when grandmother speaks, she means business." Thorby was moved from his bunkie into a less luxurious, larger room intended for 4 bachelors. His roommates were Fritz Krause, who was his eldest unmarried foster brother and president of the Starboard Bachelor Table, Chellan Krause Drotter, Thorby's foster ortho second cousin by marriage, and Jerry Kingsolver, his foster nephew by his eldest married brother. It resulted in his learning Suomic rapidly. But the words he needed first were not Suomish. They were words borrowed or invented to describe family relationships in great detail. Languages reflect cultures. Most languages distinguish brother, sister, father, mother, aunt, uncle, and link generations by great or grand. Some languages make no distinction between, for example, father and uncle, and the language reflects tribal custom. Contrariwise, some languages, e.g. Norwegian, split uncle into maternal and paternal, morbror, farbror. The free traders can state a relationship such as, "My maternal foster half-step-uncle by marriage, once removed and now deceased," in one word, one which means that relationship and no other. The relation between any spot on a family tree and any other spot can be so stated. Where most cultures find a dozen titles for relatives sufficient, the traders use more than 2,000. The languages name discreetly and quickly such variables as generations, lineal or collateral, natural or adopted, age within generation, sex of speaker, sex of relative referred to, sexes of relatives forming linkage, consanguinity or affinity, and vital status. Thorby's first task was to learn the word and the relationship which defined by it with which he must address each of more than 80 new relatives. He had to understand the precise flavor of relationship, close or distant, senior or junior. He had to learn other titles by which he would be addressed by each of them. Until he had learned all this, he could not talk, because as soon as he opened his mouth, he would commit a grave breach of manners. He had to associate 5 things for each member of the Sisu's company: a face, a full name, his own name was now Thorby Baslam Krause, a family title, that person's family title for him, and that person's ship's rank, such as chief officer or starboard second assistant cook. He learned that each person must be addressed by family title in family matters, by ship's rank concerning ship's duties, and by given names on social occasions if the senior permitted it. Nicknames hardly existed, since the nickname could be used only down, never up. Until he grasped these distinctions, he could not be a functioning member of the family, even though he was legally such. The life of the ship was a caste system of such complexity of privileges, obligations, and required reactions to obligations as to make the stratified, protocol-ridden society of Jubal seem like chaos. The captain's wife was Thorby's mother, but she was also deputy chief officer. How he addressed her depended on what he had to say. Since he was in bachelor quarters, the mothering phase ceased before it began. Nevertheless, she treated him warmly as a son and offered her cheek for his kiss, just as she did for Thorby's roommate and elder brother Fritz. But as deputy chief officer, she could be as cold as a tax collector. Not that her status was easier. She would not be chief officer until the old woman had the grace to die. In the meantime, she was hand and voice and body servant for her mother-in-law. Theoretically, senior officers were elective. Practically, it was a one-party system with a single slate. Krause was captain because his father had been. His wife was deputy chief officer because she was his wife, and she would someday become chief officer and boss him and his ship as his mother did, for the same reason. Meanwhile, his wife's high rank carried with it the worst job in the ship, with no respite, for senior officers served for life, unless impeached, convicted, and expelled onto a planet for unsatisfactory performance, into the chilly thinness of space for breaking the ancient and pig-headed laws of Sisu. But such an event was as scarce as a double eclipse. Thorby's mother's hope lay in heart failure, stroke, or other hazards of old age. Thorby, as adopted youngest son of Captain Krause, senior male of the Krause sept, titular head of Sisu clan, the captain's mother being the real head, was senior to 3/4 of his new relatives in clan status. He had not yet acquired ship's rank. But seniority did not make life easier. With rank goeth privileges, so shall it ever be, but also with it go responsibilities and obligation, always more onerous than the privileges are pleasant. It was easier to learn to be a beggar. He was swept up in his new problems and did not see Dr. Margaret Mader for days. He was hurrying down the trunk corridor of 4th deck, he was always hurrying now, when he ran into her. He stopped. "Hello, Margaret." "Hello, Trader. I thought for a moment that you were no longer speaking to Frackie." "Aw, Margaret," she smiled. "I was joking. Congratulations, Thorby. I'm happy for you. It's the best solution under the circumstances." "Thanks. I guess so." She shifted to system English and said with motherly concern, "You seem doubtful, Thorby. Aren't things going well?" "Oh, things are all right." He suddenly blurted the truth. "Margaret, I'm never going to understand these people." She said gently, "I felt the same way at the beginning of every field of study, and this one has been the most puzzling. What is bothering you?" I don't know. I never know. Well, take Fritz. He's my older brother. He's helped me a lot. Then I miss something that he expects me to understand, and he blasts my ears off. Once he hit me. I hit back, and I thought he was going to explode." "Peck writes," said Margaret. "What?" "Never mind. It isn't scientifically parallel. Humans aren't chickens. What happened?" "Well, just as quickly he went absolutely cold, told me he would forget it, wipe it out because of my ignorance." "Noblesse oblige." "Huh? Sorry, my mind is a junkyard." "And did he?" "Completely. He's sweet as sugar. I don't know why he got sore, and I don't know why he quit being sore when I hit him." He spread his hands. "It's not natural." "No, it isn't. But few things are. Thorby, I might be able to help. It's possible that I know how Fritz works better than he knows, because I'm not one of the people." "I don't understand." "I do, I think. It's my job. Fritz was born into the people. Most of what he knows, and he is a very sophisticated young man, is subconscious. He can't explain it because he doesn't know how he knows it. It simply functions. But what I have learned these past 2 years, I have learned consciously. Perhaps I can advise you when you are shy about asking one of them. You can speak freely with me. I have no status." "Gee, Margaret, would you?" "Whenever you have time. I haven't forgotten that you promised to discuss Jubal with me either, but don't let me hold you. You seem in a hurry." "Well, not really," he grinned sheepishly. "When I hurry, I don't have to speak to as many people, and I usually don't know how." "Ah, yes. Thorby, I have photographs, names, family classifications, ship's jobs on everyone. Would it help?" "Huh? I should say so. Fritz thinks it's just enough to point someone out once and say who he is." "Then come to my room." "It's all right. I have dispensation to interview anyone there. The door opens into a public corridor. You don't cross the Purdah line." So, Thorby now actually has a chance of finding out how this crew family is organized, which would be convenient since he's now part of it. and we'll go into that more next time.